Добрий день, я вітаю всіх.
Good afternoon, hello and welcome to everyone who has joined me. My name is Olga Tamanova. I'm happy to welcome you to Ukreinformed Media Center today. It's the 10th year. It's the 10th year of the war since Russia started it against Ukraine. And traditionally, I would like to thank all of the representatives of the media who are sharing the truth about this war and the heroic opposition and resistance of the Ukrainian nation. So today we have invited you to a very interesting topic because today is the 1st of September. The day when children go to school. For all Ukrainian children, it's the beginning of the school year, but unfortunately not for all Ukrainian children it's going to start in the similar way, because we understand that part of the Ukrainian children are still staying under occupation. For some it's the 10th year, for some it's the 2nd year running. So today we will be talking exactly about how the Russian Federation is employing our children, the system of education in its propaganda, for its propaganda purposes, and how with the help of propaganda it's trying to deprive our Ukrainian children of their Ukrainian identity and how it's endeavoring to militarize them. I would like to introduce to you our participants, our speakers. With us online is Peter Pomerantsev, British journalist, specialist in media and propaganda in modern Russia, also a famous writer. Also with us is Yevgen Bondarenko, head of the Department of Information Support of the representation of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, Valentina Potapova, head of the National Advocacy Department at Alminda NGO, and Anastasia Vorobyova, also online, an analyst of the NGO Alminda. Greetings, friends, and immediately I would like to give the floor to Ms. Valentina and to show to you, dear participants, Alminda has conducted a great deal of work and has prepared this analytical material concerning textbooks, which is called the Textbooks and School in the occupied territories that the Russian Federation is using to destroy the Ukrainian identity. So I would like to give you the microphone for you to introduce this research and to share with us how much textbooks are actual tools being employed by the occupiers nowadays, and how these textbooks are to correlate with the new textbook that all of us have heard about, and know that Russia has just released a new textbook on history with a very specific vision on history. So the floor is yours. Indeed, I would like to greet everyone and congratulate them on the beginning of the new schooling year, the 1st of September. And for me, this has always been a holiday, because throughout all of my conscious life, the 1st of September was the beginning of the year, because at first I was a schoolgirl, then I became a teacher, then I became a member of faculty at a higher educational institution. So all of my life is connected with the 1st of September, but it's nearly for the 9th year running. On the 1st of September, I keep asking myself a question. How are you? How are you there in occupation, under occupation? How can we help you here? How can you help yourself to stay and remain an intelligent person, a citizen of Ukraine, and not start hating your own motherland? What are they going to teach you under occupation? How will they force you? In what ways will they be forcing you to betray your own motherland? How can we protect you? Therefore, today we would like to present this research dedicated exactly to where exactly are the children under occupation at. This research is the result of total work of teachers, Prosecutor General's office, public officials, human rights advocates, and a great number of other people who are so very much eager for the children who are staying under occupation to be finally heard, to be finally visible to the Ukrainian society and for the international community. The object of this research was the content of the textbooks and specific narratives which are underpinning for these textbooks. So what is narratives? These are specific, meaningful pieces of texts which are impactful on people's worldview, outlook, their treatment and attitude to the world around them. The subject of our research was the 23 textbooks which were withdrawn by Kharkiv prosecutorial agencies after Kharkiv region was deoccupied. So these were physical textbooks. These were not online or electronic copies. There were 23 of them. And if you are interested, you can scroll down to the last page of our research. There is an annex, and you will be able to see that these are textbooks covering primary school, the ABC books, all the way to middle school and high school textbooks. They were textbooks on literature, on geography, textbooks on civic studies, on world history, and the history of Russia. Therefore, we had a chance to consider not only the textbook, which is so much more talked about in the information space, co-authored by Tarkunov and Medinsky on history, but rather we had a whole holistic system to regard due to which the child is under occupation in another world. And when talking about textbooks meant for the primary school, the ABC books, my point is, the first thing that impressed me, for example, if I get to ask our audience a question right now, could you kindly continue? Living is loving one's motherland, for example. Living means something good. However, in these primary textbooks, we immediately find ourselves with the following. Living means serving one's motherland. Serving one's motherland, I cannot even call it a motherland. This is the grand narrative that runs through almost all of such textbooks. We singled out such 20 grand narratives, the narratives which I can quote here only some in part. The Russian ethnos, its history. This is your motherland. This is the narrative, which is the Russian language is the great and mighty. Another narrative, the opposition of the collective West, NATO, the United States to Russia. So about 20 such narratives, which we detached, singled out as the grand narratives. So what is a grand narrative? It's a narrative which is impactful on people's worldviews. We get faced in our daily lives with multitudes of such grand narratives. So in the academic science, a grand narrative is the one that has a significant impact on the establishment formation of human worldview. So there are 20 such ones. And as I said, they start all the way from the primary school and run to the high school. Also, in this research, we tried also to present these grand narratives in clustered. So we clustered them as following. First, the shaping of the old Russian, general Russian identity, something which is supposed to promote for a child who remains under occupation to stop feeling or sensing this connection, nexus with their motherland, Ukraine, but rather start to feel and understand that their new motherland is Russia. And I can tell you outrightly that despite the fact that during historic periods, the territory which is nowadays is named the Russian Federation, that it used to be named as Moscovia, the Russian Empire, and had a variety of different titles and names nearly in all textbooks, you will never see historic names of this territory, but rather Russia. Russia and the Russian nation, the Russian people. So this narrative about the Russian people, the Russian nation is really interesting because we know that the Russian Federation is a multinational formation, and it's strange, it's weird that they still call themselves the Russian people, the Russian nation. I endeavored to find the explanation to the children why they explain themselves as the Russian people, and there is one. There are some separate paragraphs which narrate and tell the children specific separate paragraphs to tell the children. So, as God forbid for these children to perhaps remember that there are some Ukrainians who live in the Russian Federation who are 15% of the population. There are some other representatives of other nationalities. So God forbid for this child to start forming some other ideas. So the Russian nation, that's it and nothing else. Another group or cluster of narratives is speaking about heroism and militarization narratives. So it's true, nearly all schooling literature is imbued with the topic of war. Oddly enough, I was very much hopeful that the textbooks on history could provide me with some ideas concerning spirituality, but no, again, it speaks about war. And there were some special separate sections which are called literature about courage, literature about war. All right, I said to myself, perhaps maybe geography will contain something different. However, in geography, there were a lot of mentions of how Russia exceeded other territories and other nations. And it continued speaking about war, naturally. And the next cluster was devoted to shaping a positive attitude to the authorities. This narrative is very interesting indeed. For a long time in my life, I taught history at school and at secondary school and tertiary school, so I can compare it against how it's done in Ukraine. So when we say about authorities or power, when you look at the Ukrainian textbooks, there is no treatment of authorities or power as something which is nearly divine. Divinely ordained power. And the very interesting quotation from the seventh form, when there is a mention of the Tsar, and there it says that the function of the Tsar was to pray. This was the period of Ivan the Terrible, so his function was to pray for his people, to attend monasteries on pilgrimages, and the king or the Tsar couldn't be criticized. And if there were any mistakes committed, these were the mistakes committed by boyars, but never about the Tsar. So these are ridiculous comments written about the time. We can laugh about it a lot. But in the 7th grade, in the 7th form, a 12-year-old kid already begins to shape this veneration of authorities. Of course, there's a lot to say about veneration of Stalin, let alone Putin, Yeltsin, and other rulers of Russia or the Russian Federation, which these books are fraught with. Next, we try to see how Ukraine is regarded in these textbooks, and we were vastly surprised because Ukraine wasn't mentioned at all. Well, I do understand that you probably catch yourselves thinking, how come no Ukraine? There is Ukraine, the Ukrainian nation, at least Ukrainian lands, but there's nothing to say about Ukraine because our country is regarded either as part of Poland, Rich Pospolita, or another territory, the territory of another land or empire. So Ukraine is never presented as an entity. And even when I try to compare these textbooks against the textbooks published in 2012 and 2020, in the interpretation of the Russian historians, it told about Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who forwarded Ukraine to Moscovia, the Moscow kingdom. So it was written in the past, in 2012. And there it spoke about joining Ukraine to Moscovia. while in the textbooks dated 2022, it speaks about only joining the army of the Zaporizhzhia Sich army. In 2022, in 2012, it speaks about the decision of the Ukrainian people, and in 2022, it speaks about the decision undertaken by the Ukrainian population. So when you finally collect all and collate all of this material, you finally get to understand that after having worked for nearly 2 months, nearly every day with all of these textbooks, even you who have a highly developed critical thinking, my critical thinking, I can own up to that, is highly developed. So I still get myself affected by all of these narratives and narrations. And just imagine a child living in this information space. These kids definitely get bombarded by them, and it will be very difficult, most likely, to get these children out of the space of these narratives and narrations. So this universal human is the purpose of all of these narratives. Somebody who enjoys the Russian identity because the Ukrainian identity doesn't exist and there is no Ukrainian identity as such. Someone who is meant to serve their motherland with their arms in their hands. So this is a very brief conclusion that can be drawn when analyzing 23 textbooks I've spoken about. So we are aware, perfectly aware, that we have managed to collect unique material indeed, which covers nearly 100 pages of quotations. And any individual can pick up these quotations, read them to themselves, and analyze them. Because in addition to analyzing these textbooks and in our expert conclusions, we have also added to that psychological, pedagogical conclusions concerning the manipulative undertones which run through these texts. But anyone who picks up these books and reads that can also draw their own conclusions. So we decided that we wouldn't stop at that, and we would try to make sure that psychologists in Ukraine will go through these textbooks again and make their own conclusions and assessments concerning the future work meant for the deoccupation of our territories in the future. Thank you very much, Ms. Valentina. And the next question I would like to pose, it goes to Peter Pomorantsev. I hope he can hear us. Peter, can you hear us? Peter, for many years you have been exploring the issues of propaganda in Russia. We know about that from your works. Multiple works have been written about that. From your perspective, recently, is this propaganda gaining swing in targeting children, I mean, and how is it impacting children?
Якщо комусь потрібен. Just a little bit embarrassed to talk Ukrainian at public events. The use of the word propaganda is very complicated here, because propaganda is not really a legal term. There is nothing illegal about propaganda. And I think what we're seeing being described by Almenda is something that we need to find a legal definition for. Yeah? Or else, what's the big deal? Yeah? And I think Almenda's work is so important because it both describes the process of indoctrination, but also starts to think about and ask questions about how we hold the people who practice this to account. We could think about international parallels. What the Chinese government do to Uyghurs and to Tibetans. We could think about the actions of the Islamic State, ISIS. We could maybe even look at some totalitarian sects. But I think that's the challenge. If we simply call this propaganda, then it's just a battle of opinions. Our mission is to show that what Russia is doing is much more than just propaganda. This is illegal, and this is done under the threat of physical or other types of force. I just came back from Kharkivshina in Vovchansk in Izium last week, and I spoke to teachers and directors of schools who were victims of violence and torture because they refused to do what the Russians wanted them to do in the educational sphere. I'm talking to parents in occupied territories every day and how they live in fear, how they live in fear that the occupation authorities will find out they are still getting their children online lessons in the Ukrainian syllabus. That's what we've got to do. We've got to show that this is not just propaganda, that this is illegal, that this is an attack on fundamental rights. And here is where it gets complicated. Because if we go all the way back to 1945 and 1948, when the ideas of genocide are being codified, we see how the original idea of genocide was changed. The original idea, as formulated in the 30s and early 40s, included identity and the right for people to have their identity, and the forceful changing of identity was meant to be part of genocide. Culture was part of genocide. In 45 and 48, when we see genocide being codified, all that is thrown out, partly by the Soviet delegation at the UN, who were worried that their nationalities policy would be defined as genocide. So and this gap was left. And we have to fill that gap in. We have to finish the work that was done in 48. It was not done in 48. In a sense, we are still literally fighting with the Soviet Union. And what we have to start talking about, so what are the legal weapons we can use to fight back against what's going on? And there are many ideas. I'm not a lawyer. But we need to start having the public discussion. Can we return the cultural path to genocide? Or do we start looking at the idea of freedom of thought, which is a fundamental right, but it's very rarely used legally? Is what the Russian authorities are doing in the occupied territories an attack on freedom of thought? Or another avenue might be the freedom to make up your own mind. That's part of Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Now, it could be all of these. It could be a combination. But we have to start talking about this. Because at the moment, the main aim of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is to impose through force a Russification and a new identity of the people. At the moment, that larger aim, the main aim, is actually lost. And that means the people in charge of it can walk free. Yeah? When we think about war crimes, we think of the generals. I think we have to start thinking of the people who organize this as well. And Almenda's work is at the avant-garde of this process. And I really hope as well it becomes an international conversation. We see elements of this practice across the world. And I hope this is the moment that we can start finding a way to both describe this evil and to hold it accountable.
Thank you very much, Peter. And we're also very much hopeful that this period, that this moment has come. And Ms. Anastasia, the question goes to you. Peter has just started this conversation concerning legal qualification of the actions undertaken by the Russian Federation. So how can we qualify these actions? Whether in the future we will be able to prosecute those people who have been working, writing, publishing these textbooks and spreading them. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to make my presentation, and there are some technical difficulties, so could you kindly wait a minute? Here we go. Peter has already started sharing about the legal qualification of this notion, and I fully support him. This is a highly complicated issue that was probably last raised at the end of the Second World War, when we talked about Germanification of the civil population under occupation. That was one of such cases regarded in the area of contemporary Poland. However, in the first place, I would like us to take a look at the dimension of the international humanitarian law and talk in general terms about whether the law of Russia teaches their own education in the territories of Ukraine. And here the answer is basically very clear, given the following provisions. First being Article 43, the Convention on the Laws and Customs of War on dry land, and an addition to it, and it speaks here about the fact that the occupying country needs to respect the laws that were operational in the occupied territories before the beginning of the occupation. So there is this principle status quo ante in the international humanitarian law. So the same laws have to remain in force, except the situations when it becomes completely exceptional. And here international legal specialists are also unanimous in when interpreting this provision, that the changes to such laws can only be introduced in a limited number of cases, and they can relate only to supporting the public law and order, maintaining public law and order. So this basically relates to the laws on education, educational programs. Also, let me draw your attention to Article 50 of the Fourth Convention, Geneva Convention on the Protection of Civilian Population in the Times of War, that the occupational authorities, in cooperation with the state and local authorities, have to promote the proper functioning of educational facilities and take care of children and their education. It also speaks here about the fact that children who remain without parental care, and if they share the same ethnic origin with these children, in line with their customs and laws of their land, will have to raise these children. Once again, there is a unanimous agreement concerning this. From this slide, you get to understand that the occupation authorities cannot introduce any fundamental occupational laws, even during the time of temporary education. So they are violating the laws on occupation established by the international humanitarian law. Be reminded that since February 24th, 2022, Russia has already included the temporary occupied territories of Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, Lugansk regions, and Crimea had been annexed to this federal system back in 2014. Yet another aspect that can be regarded in the context of these textbooks, as it was very aptly pointed by Ms. Valentina, is the propaganda of war. Indeed, the propaganda of war is an intrinsic part of the overall education exercised in the Russian Federation. They cultivate this idea that one needs to serve his own motherland or fatherland, and by that they mean going to serve in the armed forces. The conscription of the population in the armed forces in the occupied territories is also a war crime according to the Rome Statutes. However, in the Article 51 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it says that the occupying state cannot force individuals who are under protection to serve in its armed or auxiliary forces. No pressure on propaganda which aims at securing voluntary enlistment is permitted. So another very important part of this article is missing. In English, it says, no pressure of propaganda which aims at security voluntary enlistment is permitted. So this part is missing. And the meaning is that no occupational authorities can exercise pressure or propaganda, making sure that the occupied population go to fight in the army on voluntary basis. We do not understand why this particular section was omitted from the Ukrainian translation of Article 51 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, but we will allude to it a bit later when we talk about the national law enforcement. So what are the options of prosecution do we have according to international criminal law? In the first place, this is the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court concerning genocide, concerning crimes against humanity and war crimes. It's true, the issue of genocide still remains pretty much open, because the current formulation envisages rather narrow interpretation of this particular crime. For the most part, physical annihilation of a specific ethnic group in full or to a part, partially. However, a question still remains. whether destroying the cultural identity can also be regarded as part of this genocidal policy making, because we can see that the narratives which are being disseminated in the temporarily occupied territories are aimed exactly at that, to convince young people that there are no Ukrainians, Ukrainians have never existed, and instead impose on them the Russian identity. Also through going by the venue of persecuting for the crimes against humanity, although this unfortunately does not exist in the Ukrainian criminal code, we still can consider here discrimination, prosecution, because Ukrainian children are deprived of the opportunity to gain education in line with their cultural and national traditions and customs, because Russian narratives are being planted in the temporarily occupied territories. And Article 8, war crimes. Here we can also consider some narratives which are being imposed by these textbooks as a kind of propaganda to encourage people to enlist in the armed forces of the Russian Federation. With reference to the national legislation, one should remember that international persecution is complementary to the national legislation. That is to say, we always consider first national legislation when we target such cases, and we see that we have Article 438 in the Criminal Code of Ukraine concerning the violation of the laws and customs of war. But just as I have mentioned, there is one bottleneck, which is about the fact that although Ukraine signed the convention in its full scope and the English and French texts are believed to be authentic, correspondingly, the formulation of Article 51. However, in the national law enforcement, we get faced with a problem when the national courts and national laws have to be guided by the official translation, which was published on the official site of the Parliament of Ukraine, and there is no this provision. So how can we solve this conundrum? My proposal is to go to the body which is directly responsible for the translation of this convention. This is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and request them for the explanation concerning why there is no such a text, or they need to introduce the correction. This is a very complicated process, but anyway, we believe that within the current Ukrainian context, the Russo-Ukrainian war, and the possibility to prosecute for Russian war crimes spurs us to think how to most effectively bring perpetrators to account. Moreover, the international treaties and agreements that Ukraine is a signatory to provide us with this opportunity. So basically, that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you for these ramified explanations concerning all of the legal provisions. Now, Mr. Yevgen, I have a question to ask you. It's a complicated question for all of us, but most importantly, what are we to do after the deoccupation? Because we are conscious that the children who are still under occupation, for whom it's going to be the second year under occupation, this may entail one type of strategy, but for the children who have been living under occupation for the 10th year now, this is an entirely different story. So what are we to do? How can we get them back? Thank you very much indeed. Hello to everyone. I will probably start with a personal story, because today is the 1st of September, and we're talking about what's happening in the territory of the temporarily occupied Crimea. I come from Yalta. I graduated from school there in the first year of occupation back in 2014, when at schools there were graduation parties taking place. The Russian Federation instantly began to impose its own agenda, its own propaganda. And then in the media, there was a video, in fact, very important at the time. It had been made in my school when, in March 2014, the children were played the national anthem of Russia in the then occupied Crimea, and a group of graduates who are wearing blue and yellow ribbons could silence the anthem of the Russian Federation because they had started singing the national anthem of Ukraine. And in fact, this was a very important signal sent to us that despite the efforts of the Russian Federation during these 10 years, despite all of this total propaganda and militarization of childhood and youth, the systemic consistent work undertaken in this domain, there is a lot of resistance and opposition taking place even now, when for 9.5 years the territory of the Crimean Peninsula has been under occupation. So what is being done in this respect? We, as the representation of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, are monitoring the situation, and we are also making all of the interesting newsletters and analytical notes concerning all of the areas. For example, if we talk about educational sphere, we seem to target militarization, propaganda in this respect. We know that in 2023, expenditure used towards the so-called military patriotic education equaled 82,629,000,000 rubles. So this is the amount of money allocated by occupation administrations within the Russian Federation. This is as of now, but we understand by the end of the year, of course, this amount will have grown. This needs to be taken into account. Another important thing that needs to be regarded is the trends that emerged after the full-scale invasion back in 2022 and 2023. Ms. Valentina has already alluded to that, and this is also reflected in their research and as analysis of the textbooks that they had analyzed. So the Russian Federation, right from the start, began to make begin to create heroic narratives and begin to turn Russian servicemen into heroes. And this is done in different ways. They have plaques in schools where they graduated, different memory plaques on the desks where these servicemen used to study, etc. So if we talk about the year 2023, I've just checked this information. For example, what is known to us is, can you help me, please? We know that, for example, that in January 2023, occupation administrations mandatorily introduced such hours at schools. There is such an occupation to protect and defend one's motherland, friends and foes of the Russian Federation. So this is very much resonant with what has already been analyzed about the school textbooks. We also know that in Sevastopol, school number 60, every learning week began with the school children wearing military uniforms, and they began to share with them about different elements of militarization and life under occupation. Another horrible incident happened on March 29th. In the network, we had the message that in Simferopol, a school child died after he had been preparing rigorously for a patriotic competition. So he suffered from syndrome, Wolfson-Parkinson, and everyone knew about that in school. But anyway, this boy was involved in this patriotic learning and studies. So 9.5 years of occupation is a pretty long stretch of time, and we need to understand that the children who during the first year of occupation went to school, they will be graduating or have graduated from school already. So there is a new generation of children born in the first year of occupation going to school this year. So this is an important element that needs to be mentioned. So, and being well aware that the Crimean Peninsula will definitely be liberated, now we are working on the first steps to be taken by the state as part of their integration measures, something that you are also mentioning. And my department is directly responsible for cognitive deoccupation. So what we started with is in January 2023, together with the Estonian expert Dmitro Teperik, who is responsible for security issues, we conducted 22 anonymous interviews with Ukrainian experts, including representatives of the indigenous Crimean Tatar population who specialize in different areas and domains like information policy, social studies, education, and Ms. Valentina was also one of these 22 interviewees, and as a result of that, we shaped a strategy of cognitive deoccupation of the Crimea, and it allows us with the direction in which we have to move. It allows us to understand what our challenges will be and what priorities we need to shape and what work needs to be undertaken. So we present this at the end of June 2023 after heated debates. It was also sent to different line ministries and agencies for them to familiarize themselves and utilize that in their different working processes. We obtained a number of different remarks, and this document is finalized as a strategic one, and we're beginning to implement it. So what are we doing in this respect? At our representation office, we have created the Council for Cognitive Deoccupation of the Crimea. We have different representatives of local executive authorities, representatives of experts, NGOs, CSOs, including the representation of the indigenous Tatar Crimean population, Mejlis, of the Crimean Tatar population. So this council is tasked with developing a technical level. So that means the direct implementation of the strategy. By that, we mean that as part of this strategy, we also are developing the roadmap. So there's been already the first meeting, and during the second meeting, we were working on the strategic narratives and messages on shaping the structure of this roadmap. And right now, our task by the end of 2023 is to come up with a program document, which will be called the roadmap. For it to have certain areas or streams identified, and I have this document in my hands right now. So when we talk about educational reintegration, there we have two sectors. So the first one is called educational reintegration, and here we will be speaking about mobility programs, work with textbooks, resumption of educational trajectories after the occupation, understandably, resumption of the Ukrainian standards, relaunch of them, the standards that we have been that we have had running for a long time in our country. Everyone is familiar with that. And another section in this sector is the policy concerning the children and the youth, how to overcome indoctrination, how to revert the Ukrainian national and civic identity, to ensure the rights of indigenous population peoples, and to make sure that the youth remains mobile. But we have to understand all of these are our Ukrainian people who are forced to live under occupation. The Russian Federation keeps causing harm because this systemic influence and impact in this closed kind of scooped space is really detrimental, and our peers and colleagues have repeatedly mentioned that. So we will have to exercise this cognitive deoccupation, that is to say, get the people back to the social, political, cultural space, trying to communicate to them what the Ukrainian state is all about, how it has changed in the last 10 years, and what the prospects for them are open. So the understanding of the prospects is the happy medium, because as soon as the occupation takes place after the transition period, we will have to integrate our population, particularly children and young people, into the general Ukrainian space. What else is important to add? Something else that we are studying. We're studying the period. So the cognitive deoccupation and the actions targeted at achieving cognitive deoccupation of Crimea divide into three. The actions before the physical deoccupation, the actions that will be undertaken during the occupation, and reintegration actions and measures to be undertaken after the deoccupation takes place. So we say that this cognitive deoccupation should take from 10 years all the way up to one generation. So it all will heavily depend on how this work gets synchronized. But this work is being engaged, it's systemic. The meetings of this council are monthly. They're really lengthy and highly practical. And right now they are being amplified at the level of the board, of the Council on Cognitive Deoccupation, and all the way to developing the specific levels. Let me finish by a metaphor which was generated by the representatives of the Ministry of Defense. When we presented our strategy to them, they said, the roadmap is something that will undertake cognitive demining. That is to say, different ideas and notions that the Russian Federation is trying to implant in the minds of the Ukrainian population, blocking the understanding of the Ukrainian people. We, step by step, will have to eliminate and thus trying to deoccupy our fellow citizens cognitively after the deoccupation of the Crimean Peninsula. Thank you very much indeed. I seem to have a question that I want to ask you, because we frequently have different psychologists, sociologists who are engaged in different public and societal things, and they seem to conclude that this generation that has been under this occupation for 10 years is nearly lost. Do you agree with this opinion? You know, it's hard for me to answer this question. Why? Because emotionally I resist and I disagree. Because emotionally I understand that what Yevgeny has just mentioned, if this is systemic work undertaken by the state involving a great load of professionals, teachers, psychologists, sociologists, and a whole lot of other professionals, then we will be able to overcome this much sooner than within one generation. Let me give you another example, the example of Odessa after the fire on the 1st of May. You may probably remember when for Ukrainians it mattered enormously for Odessa to remain the same Odessa as we have always remembered that. And a great number of psychologists went there trying to calm down different kinds of conflicts which were beginning to swell in the city at the time, and they managed to do that. So this example, this illustration enables me to think that this generation isn't lost yet. However, well, there's an element of skepsis. The fact that we just in 10 years on, we are beginning to speak about the fact that the propaganda is beginning to destroy the Ukrainian identity. And the fact that at the August meeting at the Ministry of Education that took place in late August, they never mentioned the children under occupation. This unfortunately makes me skeptical in my understanding that nobody is going to rush saving nearly 1 million Ukrainian children in occupations. So today is the 1st of September. It's a festive day, but let it remain a day of hope that it's still going to be the first option rather than the second one. Yes, there is still a ray of hope. So now is the Q&A session. Victoria Shevchenko from Ukrinform. My question goes to Ms. Valentina. Right now, the government has made an announcement about creating the cadre pool, the cadre reserve for the deoccupied territories and for teachers in particular. From your perspective, what educational policy will have to be implemented in the territories which have been under occupation since 2014 and those that were occupied in 2022? Indeed, the government has made this announcement concerning the cadre pool and reserve, but what the Ministry of Reintegration of the territories are doing, they're creating the pool of officials. And we have also heard the statement made by Mr. Oksandly Sovy, the Minister of Education, concerning the pool of teachers who will have to be prepared specially for the purposes for the deoccupied territories. But this is just a statement. It's a great pleasure that the statement has already been made and is made public. but I am still conscious that this cannot be made somewhere on the sidelines in the offices of the Ministry of Science and Education. Exactly what Mr. Yevgen said when he sent about the Council or the Board of Specialists for Cognitive Deoccupation. I can honestly tell you that it has representative bodies and representatives of all of the bodies who are responsible for all of these issues. So when we speak about the deoccupation and cognitive deoccupation as such, it's necessary to establish a working group, a task force at the Ministry of Education and Science, and to involve there a great number of specialists who are very well aware of what has been happening during these nearly 10 years of occupation, because the people who are not involved in occupation issues, they perceive occupation to be something like, well, part of the Soviet legacy during the Second World War, like the occupation of Kharkiv region. Right now, there's another type of occupation which is taking place. We now live in another digital world. Therefore, if the Ministry of Education undertakes a step, then my advice to the Ministry of Education is to involve there as many people as possible who are very well aware of what's going on in Crimea and are very savvy about what's taking place in the Donbass, and they're very well informed about what's happening in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. Thank you. We have another question. Katerina Galko, Espresso TV channel, to Ms. Anastasia, if she's online with us. Yes, I am. I'm listening. We spoke about criminal liability with you, and you told us about that. So who do you think it will be most realistic to bring to account in the future, and are there any such actions being undertaken? Thank you for this question. Today, the prosecutorial offices have informed us that one of the offices in the occupational administration, Elena Shapurova, has been informed about the suspicion against her. Concerning how realistic this all is, can I please ask a clarification question? Is she a teacher? For those who are not aware of the details and the specifics concerning who has been served with the suspicion. She's one of the officials in the occupational administrations who's responsible for the implementation of the Russian standards in the temporarily occupied territories. We have lost connection. Oh, I beg your pardon. There was something wrong with the connection. So a criminal proceeding has been initiated against this woman. So it's one of the recent updates in terms of criminal prosecution. Talking about it at the international level, it's much harder to implement such measures because we have to qualify these cases properly. And at the International Criminal Court, it's a very lengthy process. And so it's much harder to implement. It's much more realistic from my perspective to establish an effective system of bringing people to account at the national level. So do you mean to say that at the international level you do not see any likely perspective to establish a particular body to try the war crimes and the cases that we have been mentioning today? We're still working on the possibility to draw the attention to the necessity to try such cases at the international level, the necessity to prove that this is one of the international crimes, that the crime against children is the crime of destroying their identity and replacing it with another identity, which is taking place via education, just like I have already said it. In post-war time, after the Second World War, the national level, the German Gauleiter of Poland was brought to account in Poland for Germanification of the Polish population. However, at the Nuremberg trials, such cases were not considered at the time. Therefore, for our part, we as a society, as a civil society, we will be doing our best to make sure that these crimes will be considered, will be tried at the international level. But of course, just like I've said, this will take a great number of pains, efforts, and a need to change the paradigm of thinking even. Because the right to education and children's rights, even in the international law, some seem to say that these are secondary importance rights. But in the first place, we will have to adjudicate cases about the right to life, etc. But education are of subsidiary importance.
Бути саме кримінальний вимір.
Я трошки хочу додати, сьогодні в нас з поважних причин.
Let me also add by saying that for valid reasons we do not have with us today representatives of the Prosecutor General's office, but at the Prosecutor General's office there is an international expert council who are busy dealing with the legal qualification of this type of crimes, and we have multiple meetings there where together, I'm not a legal professional, but there are multiple legal practitioners who have been involved at the Regional Center of Human Rights and other legal practitioners of the coalition of 5 o'clock. And I can tell you honestly that we are a powerful community involved in this study. Right now, a lot of active work is being undertaken in order to discover the crime for which, according to the international crime, at the international level, all the perpetrators will be brought to account. I have a question to venerable specialists. So the question is concerning the teachers who, during these 10 years in Crimea, who have been changing one another. So what are you observing? Is there a lot of pressure exerting on the people who are unwilling to spread this propaganda? Maybe this year, when this new textbook on history has been released and the high school students will have to study according to them, perhaps there will be many students who will disagree to study according to them. And I know that there is a special methodology developed by Russia, and perhaps 150 hours will have to be allocated towards working in the historic dimension. So what is being done to the teaching faculty, especially the ones who do not believe in this propaganda? Have you documented, Ms. Valentina, the amount of propaganda which is being planted in the minds of the Ukrainian children? Maybe back in 2014, this was softer. Maybe right now it's even more nonsensical and more open. Well, I will endeavor to answer this question with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Russian Federation introduced in its administrative and criminal code some new articles for the so-called discreditation of the Russian army, just to keep it very briefly. The names of this article run for as long as 4 sentences, so the so-called 23.3. And they spread these articles to the territory of Crimea and other temporarily occupied territories. Since the point of enacting this article, we have been familiarized about more than 400 proceedings initiated in terms of this article. Sometimes these are pecuniary fines. Sometimes people are detained for up to 15 days. So there are different instances, what for listening to Ukrainian music, public singing in Ukrainian tattoos, literature, and other actions and activities. More often than not, Bogdan Zizia, who splashed some paint, blue and yellow paint on the local administration building, who was incriminated with an attack on public safety, and he was, by the way, sentenced to 11 years of imprisonment. There are many, many people like this. More than 50 cases when people are brought to account for the so-called discreditation of the Russian army. These are the representatives of the youth who, despite this all-out war and totalitarianism, still are active in expressing their stances. This is being very actively done in social media, and I think Ms. Valentina can share more about that, about the information which is being passed to mainland Ukraine. So they usually call it do some harm to the Russians. And of course, the Ukrainian teachers are trying not to do what they are being imposed on. There are a lot of teachers who had to resign, understanding that they will never have another choice. They will not be able to resist because there will be a lot of force used against them. It's true there are such cases when people resigned. They're our fellow citizens. They don't want to live under occupation according to the rules of the occupiers. I cannot remember exactly, but it seems to me one of such recent cases when they tried to bring to account for the so-called discreditation of the Russian army. We found an instance that it was someone who was working in one of the schools. It was a woman working for one of the schools in the occupied Crimea. And they incriminated against her that she is a Russian language teacher. But you have to understand the plain trend that the occupation administrations after the annexation of Crimea, the teachers who used to teach Ukrainian literature and language were retrained, and right now they specialize in teaching the Russian literature and language. So there is this case when this teacher was incriminated. So more than 400 incriminations, it's a huge number during 9.5 years. So this is just a share that has been documented, but there are hundreds of other instances when occupiers simply don't know about resistance, and it's important to talk about that in answer to the question whether there are such people who are still resisting in Crimea. There are different schools, different people. Even if we draw parallels or comparisons, there are some schools that go for propaganda, specialized schools established for this purpose. And as opposed to that, there are other schools who try to avoid it to the best of their ability. But when talking about specific people, we'd better avoid using their names, lest we put them in danger. Also, briefly, to answer your question, concerning teachers, the teaching faculty. So we are talking about the so-called teaching engineering, when they introduced into Crimea teachers from the Russian Federation to replace the teachers who had been forced to resign from schools under pressure. It's true. In Crimea, back in 2014 and 15, the replacement in the area of education was taking place in a very soft way. Because right now in Kherson and Zaporizhia region, we see more rigid scenarios in place and at work. And some teachers who used to teach the Ukrainian literature and language have been offered not just to retrain to become the Russian language and literature teachers, or also to requalify as librarians, other positions. And people simply refused and went against that, and they just resigned from schools. I worked at a university for 10 years. I had many graduates who eventually became teachers in Crimea. And I can honestly tell you that all of my students who were pro-Ukrainians, they were forced to resign. Not a single student with a pro-Ukrainian stance is teaching now because the conditions were created. I'm going to cite someone, to quote someone. When a teacher was called to see the principal at school, and he said, why am I supposed to resign? Because they said, you are teaching history improperly, incorrectly, and look at my materials, everything is proper and fine. No, they said, you are sharing in your lessons inadequately about the grandeur of Russia. I couldn't believe it. And I said, this beats me. And he said, that was true. Concerning school textbooks, it's true that the propaganda propagandist impact of the textbooks is growing, and it's amplifying in its strength. All of the textbooks of new edition were written under Turkunov. This was written back in 2022, 2023, some amendments. And the latest textbook authored by Medinsky and Turkunov, it's not a textbook at all. It's a propagandist text. Because in our research, you will be able to see what we write. Textbooks usually have a very qualitative didactical component, but this book, co-written by Medinsky and Turkunov, has no didactical component. It's a purely propagandist text. And it starts right from the very beginning. When you open this textbook, it begins with 1945, and on the first page of this textbook, you will see the picture taken from the code of the communist, the code for communist builder, and the next picture will be Yuri Gagarin. So the first page, which is supposed to start with 1945, the first instead is the quote by Vladimir Putin that the greatest disaster and catastrophe of the 20th century is the disintegration of the former Soviet Union. This is exactly what the 11th graders are faced with as soon as they open these textbooks. Then I do not even endeavor to comment on what you get to read. So from didactics, they move on to propagandist materials. 3 more textbooks are in the pipeline, and there are already some changes introduced to the state standards by which all of these textbooks, called textbooks, will have to undergo propaganda transformations. Thank you. One more question. Andrei Krustalov from Informator UA. My question goes to Mr. Bondarenko. Look, you have just been sharing about the cognitive deoccupation, which is to take place at 3 stages. And the first stage probably is already taking place. It's supposed to be taking place concerning Crimea, I mean. So my question is it theory, or are there any practical steps being undertaken? And if there are such ones, what are they? And one more question, if I may. It's been mentioned that the people who are supposed to be on this team, because I understand that it's a very broad question, cognitive deoccupation, the people who are supposed to participate in this project have to be involved. Somehow they have to have some connection to Crimea. So where will you get these people from? So these are my questions. Thank you. Yes, I will try to be brief, because today's event is not about our strategy, but anyway, there are such people, believe me. And if you're working with the temporarily occupied Crimea, there are such people, and they're already members of this council. These are journalists, culturologists, psychologists, different figures in culture, representatives of the government authorities, and not only, just to keep it very simple and brief. Or these may also be the people who have been working with the topic of the temporarily occupied Crimea for these last 10 years, and they are very savvy about this context. Concerning the practicality, I have already said that the implementation of the cognitive deoccupation will be done before, during, and after. And I have already told you that we have already had 2 meetings. There is the 3rd one in preparation, and there is a lot of practical work being done in between these meetings. So in answer to your question, if something practical is taking place right now, yes. We are not stopping at just creating the strategy. We're already preparing the first stages of its implementation. So this is something which is taking place right now. The narratives that we have identified, they also belong to the strategy of cognitive deoccupation. What are we to deoccupy? We have to determine what the children will have in their minds, or they already have in their minds, and how we are going to go about working with that. It's also an integral part of this work. Thank you very much indeed, dear friends. Lots of thanks to our speakers for this substantive and meaningful conversation, in-depth conversation. Thank you to all of you. Please stay tuned to us. I would like to thank to our armed forces, due to whom we can conduct such events. So please stay with us. We keep working for the sake of our victory, and glory to Ukraine, glory to her heroes. Thank you.